The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Carson as Captain Alexis Hawk Morgan completed her third consecutive week of aircraft maintenance duty. At 0600 hours, while her male counterparts were suiting up for combat missions over the training grounds, Morgan found herself once again inspecting rotor blades and checking hydraulic systems on grounded Apache helicopters. Morgan stood barely 5'4" with auburn hair pulled back in regulation style, her green eyes holding an intensity that seemed too fierce for her delicate features. At 28, she was one of the youngest Apache pilots ever certified, but also one of the most sidelined. Her colleagues had given her the call sign Hawk, supposedly for her precise flying. But Morgan knew the real reason they saw her as too soft, too caring, too emotionally invested in every mission briefing where casualties were discussed. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd graduated top of her class from flight school, could thread an Apache through mountain passes that gave seasoned pilots nightmares, and had logged more simulator hours than any pilot in her squadron. But every time a real combat mission arose, she found herself assigned to base security transport runs or maintenance supervision. "Captain Morgan," called out Colonel Victor Harmon, her commanding officer, as he approached the hangar. Harmon was a bear of a man with graying temples and a voice that carried the authority of 2 decades in combat aviation. His weathered face told the story of a Desert Storm veteran who'd seen the worst of what combat could offer. "I need you to run a supply mission to Outpost Eagle today. Medical supplies and ammunition for the advanced teams." Morgan nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the familiar sting of disappointment. "Yes, sir. What's the cargo weight and destination coordinates?" "Standard transport load." Harmon paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You'll be taking Black Hawk 772, not an Apache. The attack birds are reserved for pilots who can handle the pressure of real combat." Harmon's words carried the casual dismissal that Morgan had grown accustomed to, but they still cut deep. Outpost Eagle sat nestled in the mountains of Colorado, a strategic position that served as a staging point for operations deeper into the training grounds. It was important work, Morgan knew, but it wasn't combat. It wasn't the reason she'd spent 5 years training to be one of the most lethal pilots in the sky. The other pilots in her squadron, Major Scott Viper Williams, Captain Derek Thunder Rodriguez, and Lieutenant Mark Granite Jenkins, were currently suiting up for their second combat sortie of the week. She watched them through the hangar window, noting the easy confidence in their movements, the way they joked and checked each other's equipment. They were heading to provide close air support for a Ranger reconnaissance unit that had encountered heavy resistance during a training exercise near Widow's Canyon. "Wish we could take Morgan with us," she heard Williams say as the group passed by her workstation. "Yeah, but you know command's position," Rodriguez replied, lowering his voice, but not enough that Morgan couldn't hear. "They're worried she'll freeze up when it comes time to pull the trigger. All that emotion, it's a liability in combat." Jenkins shook his head. "I've seen her in training. She's got better reflexes than any of us and can put ordnance on target with surgical precision. The emotional thing is, maybe," Williams shrugged, "but until she proves she can handle the heat, she stays on the bench." Morgan's hands tightened around the wrench she was holding. The emotional label had followed her throughout her career, born from a single incident during advanced training. During a mission briefing about a recent operation that had resulted in civilian casualties, she had vocally questioned the tactical decisions that led to those deaths. Her instructors had noted her excessive emotional response to mission parameters, and the stigma had stuck like glue. What they didn't understand was that her emotional investment made her better, not worse. She studied every mission profile with obsessive detail, memorized casualty statistics to understand the human cost of every tactical decision, and approached every training exercise with the weight of real lives in mind. Her precision in flight simulations wasn't despite her emotions, it was because of them. As the morning briefing concluded, Morgan found herself approached by Master Sergeant Frank Sullivan, a 68-year-old former pilot who now served as a civilian consultant for the base. Sullivan's weathered face carried the lines of someone who'd seen more combat than most of the active duty personnel combined. His time during the Cold War and both Gulf Wars had given him a perspective that few others possessed. "Don't let Harmon get under your skin," Sullivan said, his voice a gravelly whisper as they walked away from the hangar. "He's from the old school, thinks emotional detachment is what makes a good combat pilot." Morgan glanced at the older man. "With all due respect, sir, isn't that what everyone thinks? Sullivan's laugh was short and harsh. That's what they teach you these days. But I've seen too many detached pilots make cold calculations that cost lives, and I've seen too few who care enough to find another way. They reached the edge of the airfield where the mountains rose in the distance like silent sentinels. Sullivan pointed toward a particular formation to the west. You've been studying Widow's Canyon, haven't you? Morgan stiffened. How did you know that base security flagged your access to the topographical database? 300 hours in the past month alone. Nobody studies terrain that intensively unless they're planning something. Instead of reprimanding her, Sullivan nodded approvingly. Good. Knowledge of the terrain is what separates the living from the dead in mountain combat. He looked around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then continued in a lower voice. That canyon has a history few people know about. Back in '83, during the height of the Cold War, we ran a special program there. Operation Nightshade. Morgan had never heard the name before, but something in Sullivan's tone made her pay close attention. What kind of operation? The kind that doesn't exist in any official record, Sullivan replied. We were training pilots for missions that were considered impossible high-risk infiltrations into Soviet airspace using experimental flight techniques, ways to fly that broke every rule in the manual. Morgan's interest was piqued. What happened to the program? Officially, it never existed. Sullivan's eyes took on a distant look. Unofficially, 3 pilots died testing the limits of what was possible, and the program was shut down. The techniques were deemed too dangerous, removed from all training materials. But some of us never forgot what we learned there. They reached Sullivan's office, a small room filled with maps and flight manuals. He closed the door behind them and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook from a locked drawer. I've watched your simulator runs, Morgan. You fly differently than the others. You calculate risk differently. You see patterns in the terrain that most pilots miss. He placed the notebook on the desk between them. This contains everything I learned during Nightshade. Techniques that could get you through terrain no Apache should be able to navigate. Morgan stared at the notebook, understanding the value of what Sullivan was offering. Why show me this? Because someday someone's going to need a pilot who can do the impossible. And when that day comes, I want them to have you. Sullivan's gaze was steady. But this knowledge comes with responsibility. These techniques killed good pilots who weren't ready for them. Morgan nodded solemnly. I understand. Good. Sullivan opened the notebook, revealing hand-drawn diagrams of flight paths through narrow canyons. Then let's begin. For the next 3 months, Morgan divided her time between official duties and clandestine training with Sullivan. Every free moment was spent studying the terrain of Widow's Canyon, memorizing wind patterns that could slam an aircraft into a mountain wall without warning, and practicing specialized flight techniques in simulator programs that Sullivan had modified to accept inputs that the standard training software rejected as impossible. The Western approach to Widow's Canyon, nicknamed Devil's Gate by the Nightshade pilots, became her particular focus. A narrow corridor barely wide enough for an Apache's rotor span, with sheer cliff walls rising hundreds of feet on either side. Standard flight doctrine classified it as impassable, too dangerous for even emergency operations. But Sullivan's notebooks revealed something the official assessments missed. 3 times each day, thermal patterns created a specific wind phenomenon, a wind window, that could be exploited by a pilot who understood exactly how to read the terrain and adjust their flight controls with millisecond precision. Morgan created detailed maps of the canyon that existed nowhere in official military databases. She annotated them with information on wind patterns, optimal approach vectors, and emergency landing zones that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. She developed specialized navigation equipment from components purchased with her own money and stored them in a locker that only she and Sullivan could access. Her colleagues noticed her intensified focus, but attributed it to the typical overcompensation of a pilot trying to prove herself worthy of combat missions. Colonel Harmon observed her increased time in the simulator, but saw it as confirmation of his assessment, a pilot who needed to rely on simulated scenarios because she wasn't ready for real combat decisions. What none of them understood was that Morgan wasn't preparing for the missions they thought she wanted. She was preparing for the mission that no one else could fly. The crisis began on a clear Tuesday morning in October. Morgan was completing pre-flight checks on a transport helicopter when the base alarm system activated with a wailing that cut through the routine morning activities. Within seconds, Colonel Harmon's voice came over the facility-wide communication system. All combat personnel to emergency stations. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Morgan abandoned her checklist and ran toward the operations center, joining the stream of personnel responding to the alert. Inside, chaos reigned as officers gathered around tactical displays showing the unfolding situation. Colonel Harmon stood at the center, coordinating with multiple units as reports flooded in from the field. His face was grim as he addressed the assembled pilots. At 0700 hours, a training exercise in Widow's Canyon went critical. A major landslide has blocked all standard access routes, trapping 847 Rangers in the canyon system. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly with a severe storm front moving in within the next 6 hours. The tactical display showed the trapped Rangers' positions scattered throughout the canyon in what should have been a routine training operation. Morgan studied the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had spent hundreds of hours memorizing every contour of that landscape. Sir, Captain Rodriguez asked, "What about the eastern approach for extraction?" Harmon shook his head. "Reconnaissance drones show the landslide has completely sealed that route. The northern and southern approaches are equally compromised." What Harmon said next sent a chill through the room. "And we have a more serious situation developing. Our surveillance systems have detected armed personnel moving through the canyon who are not part of the exercise. Initial assessment suggests a domestic terrorist group has infiltrated the area." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was potentially a hostage situation, with nearly 1,000 American soldiers at risk. Captain Sarah Mitchell, the intelligence officer, stepped forward with a tablet displaying surveillance footage. "We've identified the group as Black River, a private military corporation that went rogue 3 years ago. They're led by this man, former CIA Colonel James Reynolds." The screen showed a man in his early 60s with steel gray hair and the hard eyes of someone who had seen too much of the world's darkness. Morgan didn't recognize him, but she noticed Colonel Harmon's face tighten with what looked like recognition, followed by a flash of something deeper. Was it guilt? "Reynolds was a highly decorated field operative," Mitchell continued. "After retiring from the CIA, he founded Black River, which provided security services to government contractors until allegations of war crimes in Iraq led to their contracts being terminated. They've since gone underground, reportedly selling their services to the highest bidder, including hostile foreign interests." Harmon's voice was tight as he added, "Reynolds is highly trained and extremely dangerous and has extensive knowledge of our protocols and capabilities. And now he has 847 of our people trapped in a canyon with limited supplies and ammunition." As the briefing continued, Morgan's mind raced with calculations. The standard extraction routes were blocked, and conventional wisdom said there was no other way in or out of the canyon. But she knew differently. Devil's Gate, the western approach that everyone considered impassable, was still viable. It would require precision flying beyond anything taught in standard training, but with Sullivan's techniques it was possible. The question was whether anyone would listen to her. As if reading her thoughts, Sullivan appeared at her side, his weathered face grim. "They're going to try the standard approaches and fail," he whispered. "Reynolds knows our playbook too well." Morgan nodded slightly. "The western corridor." "Not yet," Sullivan cautioned. "Let them try it their way first. They won't believe us until they've exhausted all conventional options." Harmon was outlining the initial rescue plan. "Williams Rodriguez, you'll lead Alpha Team for the first extraction attempt. We'll try to punch through the eastern blockage with precision munitions, create an extraction corridor for the Rangers nearest that position." The pilots nodded, their faces set with determination as they received their assignments. Morgan waited for her name, but it never came. Once again, she was being sidelined during a critical mission. As the briefing concluded and pilots rushed to their aircraft, Morgan approached Harmon. "Sir, request permission to join the extraction team." Harmon barely glanced at her. "Denied, Morgan. I need every combat-ready pilot on this mission." The implication was clear: she wasn't considered combat-ready. Before she could protest, Mitchell pulled her aside. "There's something you should know," the intelligence officer said quietly. "Reynolds and Harmon have history. They served together in a classified operation during Desert Storm." Mitchell's expression was grave as she continued. "In '91, they were part of a deep reconnaissance team in Iraq tracking WMDs. Reynolds was captured when their position was compromised. Harmon made the call to abort the mission rather than risk more casualties in a rescue attempt. Morgan processed this new information. So Reynolds was left behind. He spent 3 years in an Iraqi prison before escaping during the chaos of Operation Desert Fox in '98, Mitchell confirmed. By then, Harmon had been promoted and decorated for other missions. Reynolds never forgave him for the abandonment. So this isn't just a random terrorist incident. Mitchell's expression was grim. Reynolds has been planning this for years. He chose Widow's Canyon specifically because he knew it would be the perfect trap, and Harmon is the real target. Before Morgan could ask more questions, Sullivan appeared at her side. "We need to prepare," he said simply. "This situation is going to get worse before it gets better." The first extraction attempt failed catastrophically. Alpha Team, led by Williams and Rodriguez, attempted to breach the eastern blockage with precision munitions, only to encounter sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons that Black River had positioned in anticipation of exactly this approach. Rodriguez's Apache took a direct hit from a surface-to-air missile and went down hard in the northern section of the canyon. Williams barely managed to evade the barrage of fire, his Apache returning to base with multiple impact marks from small arms fire. His face was ashen as he reported to Colonel Harmon. "They knew exactly where we'd come from, exactly what our approach would be. Those weren't standard weapons, Ver. They've got military-grade anti-aircraft systems positioned at every conventional entry point." The operations center erupted in renewed activity as officers scrambled to process this escalation. A trapped Ranger unit was one thing. A Ranger unit facing a well-armed terrorist force with military-grade weapons was something else entirely. Captain Mitchell updated the tactical display with new intelligence. Rodriguez survived the crash but is pinned down. Black River forces are moving to secure his position. We've also lost contact with 3 Ranger squads in the southern section of the canyon. Harmon's expression hardened as he processed the deteriorating situation. "Prepare Beta Team for a multi-vector approach. We'll hit them from multiple angles simultaneously, overwhelm their defensive positions." Morgan studied the tactical display, noting the positions where Black River had established anti-aircraft capabilities. Their deployment wasn't random. They had anticipated standard military doctrine and positioned their assets accordingly. But there was still no indication they had covered the western approach through Devil's Gate. She started to speak up, but felt Sullivan's hand on her arm. "Not yet," he cautioned again. "They're not desperate enough to listen." The base communications system suddenly crackled with an unauthorized transmission that overrode the standard frequencies. A calm, measured voice filled the operations center. "Colonel Harmon, it's been a long time." The room fell silent as everyone recognized the voice from the intelligence briefing, James Reynolds. Harmon's face drained of color as he grabbed a communications handset. "Reynolds, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "Finishing what we started in Iraq, Victor." Reynolds' voice carried the casual confidence of someone who held all the advantages. "You left me to rot in that prison while you collected your medals and promotions. Now I'm returning the favor. There are 847 innocent soldiers trapped in that canyon, Reynolds. This is between you and me." "Precisely my point. You care about those men, which gives me leverage. I want $50 million in untraceable cryptocurrency transferred to the account information I've just sent to your intelligence officer. You have 6 hours before I start executing prisoners, beginning with your downed pilot." The transmission cut off, leaving a stunned silence in the operations center. Harmon slammed the handset down with enough force to crack its plastic casing. As the implications of Reynolds' ultimatum sank in, a young intelligence analyst approached Captain Mitchell with a tablet. "Ma'am, we've intercepted communications from Black River. They have some kind of prototype-directed energy weapon. Department of Defense, classification level Omega." Mitchell's eyes widened as she scanned the technical specifications. "This is a military prototype that went missing from a research facility 3 months ago. It's a vehicle-mounted laser system capable of disabling aircraft electronics and slicing through armored vehicles." She handed the tablet to Harmon. "Sir, this changes the tactical equation significantly. Our standard countermeasures won't be effective against this technology." Harmon's expression darkened further. "Mitchell, verify that account information. I need to contact command about the ransom demand." His voice was tight with controlled fury. "And get me a direct line to Special Forces Command. We need their hostage rescue team here immediately." Mitchell nodded grimly. "Sir, earliest estimated arrival for Special Forces is 14 hours due to the storm system moving in. All nearby assets are deployed on other operations. And then we proceed with Beta Team as planned. We're not leaving our people in there with that psychopath. As Harmon stormed off to coordinate with a higher command, Morgan turned to Sullivan. Reynolds knows all the standard approaches. He's anticipated everything in the playbook. Sullivan nodded. Everything except what isn't in the playbook. He glanced meaningfully toward the western edge of the tactical display toward Devil's Gate. The win window opens in 3 hours. If you're going to convince them, it needs to be soon. Morgan took a deep breath, knowing that her next move would either save lives or end her military career. Possibly both. Beta Team's extraction attempt failed even more spectacularly than Alpha Team's. Harmon had authorized a coordinated multi-vector approach with 4 Apache helicopters striking simultaneously from different angles, hoping to overwhelm Black River's defensive capabilities. But Reynolds had anticipated this standard tactic as well. The Black River forces revealed their advanced weaponry, portable electromagnetic pulse generators that disabled the targeting systems on 2 of the Apaches, forcing them to retreat. The remaining 2 pressed the attack but encountered concentrated anti-aircraft fire that forced them to break off their approach. Worse still, Colonel Harmon, who had insisted on leading the mission personally, took a hit to his helicopter's tail rotor. His emergency landing placed him directly in the canyon, now trapped with the very Rangers he had been trying to rescue. The operations center fell into a grim silence as they processed this development. Reynolds now had exactly what he wanted: Harmon himself as a hostage, a perfect revenge for the abandonment in Iraq. Captain Mitchell assumed command, her face set with determination as she addressed the remaining pilots. We need alternatives, people. Standard approaches have failed twice. Reynolds has studied our playbook and has counters for everything we've tried. Morgan exchanged a glance with Sullivan, who gave her a slight nod. It was time. Ma'am, Morgan said, stepping forward, there is another way into the canyon, the western approach through Devil's Gate. Mitchell looked skeptical. That corridor is classified as impassable in the flight manual. The winds make it a death trap. Not always, Morgan replied, pulling out her personal tablet and connecting it to the main tactical display. I've been studying the wind patterns in that sector for months. 3 times daily, a specific thermal phenomenon creates what we call a wind window, a period of approximately 20 minutes when the air currents stabilize enough to allow passage for a skilled pilot. The display showed Morgan's detailed mapping of the wind patterns, complete with timestamps and velocity calculations. The precision of her analysis was evident to everyone in the room. And the next window opens in exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes, she concluded. Mitchell studied the data with growing interest. Even if the wind conditions are navigable, that corridor is barely wide enough for an Apache's rotor span. One miscalculation and you'd impact the canyon walls. I'm aware of the risks, ma'am. Sullivan stepped forward. Captain Morgan's assessment is correct. The western approach is viable during these specific windows. Mitchell's eyes narrowed as she looked at Sullivan. And how would you know that, Master Sergeant? Because I flew through it myself back in '83, Operation Nightshade. A murmur ran through the assembled officers. Few had heard of the classified Cold War program, but all recognized the significance of Sullivan's statement. Operation Nightshade was decommissioned for a reason, Mitchell countered. 3 pilots died testing experimental flight techniques. 3 pilots died, Sullivan agreed, but some of us survived. The techniques work if you have the right pilot. He nodded toward Morgan. And she's better than I ever was. Mitchell looked between Sullivan and Morgan, weighing the impossible decision before her. Every conventional approach had failed catastrophically. Reynolds had anticipated and countered standard military doctrine at every turn, but this was something he couldn't have prepared for because it wasn't in any manual or playbook. Show me your full plan, Captain, she said finally. Morgan pulled up her detailed flight plan showing approach vectors, optimal altitudes, and response patterns for various wind conditions. The thoroughness of her preparation was evident in every detail, from fuel consumption estimates to weapons deployment strategies. My proposal is to use the western approach to bypass Black River's defensive positions. With the element of surprise, I can target their command and control infrastructure, disrupt their operations, and create extraction corridors for the trapped Rangers. Mitchell studied the plan carefully. This is beyond unconventional, Morgan. It borders on suicidal. With respect, ma'am, what's suicidal is continuing to try approaches that Reynolds has already proven he can counter. Morgan's voice was steady, her conviction evident. He knows our playbook because it's his playbook too. The only way to beat him is to use tactics that were never in any book to begin with. The operations center had fallen silent, all eyes on the confrontation between the captain and the intelligence officer. Mitchell's decision would determine the fate of 847 Rangers, a downed pilot, and now Colonel Harmon himself. After what seemed like an eternity, Mitchell shook her head. I can't officially authorize this, Captain. Command has explicitly ordered us to wait for special forces. Morgan felt her heart sink, but then Mitchell continued in a lower voice. However, I'll be conducting a full inventory of our aircraft in approximately 30 minutes. If an Apache were to go missing during that time, we wouldn't notice until the inventory was complete. She met Morgan's eyes with a meaningful look. Do you understand what I'm saying, Captain? Morgan nodded, understanding perfectly. Mitchell was offering her a window of deniability, a chance to attempt the rescue without official authorization. I understand, ma'am. As the officers dispersed to prepare for the Special Forces' arrival, Sullivan pulled Morgan aside. You'll only get one shot at this. If you miss the win window, or if your approach isn't perfect. I know, Morgan interrupted. I've run the simulation over 100 times. I can do this. Sullivan studied her face, seeing the determination that others had mistaken for emotional weakness. They underestimated you because you care too much, but that's exactly why you'll succeed where others failed. He pressed something into her hand, an old service pistol that had seen better days. This got me through the worst days of the Cold War. Now it's yours. Morgan accepted the weapon, understanding the gravity of what she was about to attempt. In less than 2 hours, she would either save 847 lives or join the list of pilots who had died trying to tame Devil's Gate. As she walked toward the hangar where her Apache waited, Morgan felt a strange calm settle over her. Every moment of her career had led to this, every simulator hour, every topographical study, every dismissal and disappointment. She had been preparing for this mission her entire life, whether she knew it or not. The mission that no one else could fly. As Morgan conducted her final equipment check, a voice from behind made her freeze. I thought I might find you here. She turned to see Captain Mitchell standing in the hangar doorway, arms crossed, but expression unreadable. Ma'am, I can explain. Mitchell raised a hand to silence her. Save it, Morgan. We both know what you're planning. She walked closer, looking over the specialized equipment Morgan had laid out, the custom navigation system. Sullivan's old notebook detailed maps of the Western approach. Do you understand what happens if you fail? Mitchell asked quietly. If I fail, I die, Morgan replied simply. And if you succeed but get caught, court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly prison time for theft of military equipment and disobeying direct orders. Mitchell nodded, seemingly satisfied with Morgan's understanding of the stakes. Reynolds just sent another transmission. He's moved up his timeline. First executions begin in 4 hours, not 6. Morgan felt her blood run cold. That's barely enough time for the win window and extraction. Exactly. Mitchell pulled out a small device and placed it on the workbench. This will temporarily disable the tracking systems on your Apache. You'll be invisible to our radar for approximately 3 hours. After that, the system will automatically reactivate. Morgan stared at the device, then at Mitchell. Why are you helping me? Because Harmon was wrong about you. Your emotional investment doesn't make you weak. It makes you the only pilot who cares enough to attempt something this insane. Mitchell's expression softened slightly. And because I served with Reynolds too, I know what he's capable of, and I know standard protocols won't stop him. She held out her hand. I was never here. This conversation never happened. The inventory won't begin for another 25 minutes. That should give you enough time to get airborne. Morgan shook Mitchell's hand, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me, Mitchell replied grimly. Just bring our people home. As Mitchell left, Morgan returned to her preparations with renewed urgency. The specialized navigation equipment designed to function in the unique wind conditions of Devil's Gate. Sullivan's notebook containing flight techniques that existed nowhere else. Her personal maps annotated with information accumulated over months of obsessive study. She donned her flight gear methodically, each piece a commitment to the mission that couldn't be undone. Her hands were steady as she completed the final checks. Her mind cleared despite the knowledge that she was about to attempt something that had killed experienced pilots during Operation Nightshade. The pre-flight sequence for the Apache was second nature after years of training. The powerful engines spun up with a whisper that belied their lethal capability. Morgan ran through her mental checklist one final time. Weapon systems M230 chain gun with 200 rounds of ammunition, 16 Hellfire missiles, electronic countermeasures fully operational, navigation custom system calibrated for Devil's Gate wind patterns, GPS coordinates for all known Black River positions, communication encrypted channel to Sullivan, who would monitor her approach from the operations center and provide updates on wind conditions. As the Apache lifted off into the darkening sky, Morgan felt a sense of purpose that transcended fear. She was no longer the emotional pilot that others had dismissed. She was the only pilot who could save 847 trapped Rangers, a downed comrade, and a commanding officer who had never believed in her abilities. The western approach to Widow's Canyon waited like a challenge that had been issued decades ago, one that she was finally ready to answer. Devil's Gate lay ahead, a narrow passage between sheer cliff walls that had claimed the lives of pilots who dared to test its limits. Morgan set her course and activated her communication link to Sullivan. Nightshade Actual, this is Hawk, I am airborne, and proceeding to insertion point. Wind window status. Sullivan's voice came through with perfect clarity. Hawk, this is Nightshade Actual. Wind window opens in exactly 47 minutes. Current conditions optimal. You are cleared hot for Operation Redemption. Morgan allowed herself a small smile at the impromptu operation name. Redemption indeed, not just for herself, but for a program that had been abandoned, for techniques that had been deemed too dangerous, and for a principle that had been forgotten. Sometimes caring too much was exactly what a mission required. Roger that, Nightshade Actual. Operation Redemption is go. The Apache banked westward, its sleek profile disappearing into the gathering storm clouds as Morgan flew toward a canyon that conventional wisdom said was impossible to navigate. She was about to prove that impossible wasn't permanent. The Apache helicopter cut through the gathering darkness, its silhouette barely visible against the storm clouds massing on the horizon. Inside the cockpit, Captain Alexis Morgan focused on the navigation display showing her approach to Widow's Canyon. The western route, Devil's Gate, lay ahead, a narrow passage between sheer cliff walls that conventional military doctrine classified as impassable. But Morgan wasn't flying by conventional doctrine. Nightshade Actual, this is Hawk, she transmitted on the encrypted channel. Approaching insertion point. Wind window status. Sullivan's voice crackled through her headset. Hawk, wind patterns are holding stable. Window opens in 14 minutes. Current velocity at entry point is 42 knots with 12-degree vertical variance. Morgan processed the information, making minute adjustments to her flight path. The specialized navigation system she'd developed was tracking thermal patterns and air currents, invisible to standard military equipment. On her heads-up display, the wind flows appeared as color-coded streams, red for dangerous shear zones, yellow for variable currents, green for the narrow channels of stable air that would carry her through Devil's Gate. Roger that, beginning descent to optimal approach altitude. As she brought the Apache down to 500 feet above the rugged terrain, Morgan received an unexpected transmission on the emergency channel. This is Thunder requesting immediate extraction, taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Rodriguez, the pilot who'd been shot down during the first rescue attempt, was still alive. Morgan keyed her mic. Thunder, this is Hawk. I read you. What's your situation? Hawk, Rodriguez's surprise was evident even through the static. What are you doing on this channel? Where's Beta Team? Beta Team is grounded. Colonel Harmon's Apache went down. He's trapped in the canyon with the Rangers. A burst of static followed by muffled gunfire came through the channel before Rodriguez responded. Situation critical. Black River forces converging on my position. I'm holed up in a rock formation about 2 clicks south of Ranger Team Alpha's last known location. Morgan checked her tactical display. Rodriguez's position was deep in the canyon, well past the treacherous entrance she was about to attempt. Copy that, Thunder. Hold position. I'm inbound through the western approach. Western approach. Rodriguez's voice rose in disbelief. That's suicide, Hawk. Devil's Gate is a no-fly zone. Not today, it isn't, Morgan replied with a confidence she'd earned through months of preparation. Nightshade protocol is in effect. The silence that followed told Morgan that Rodriguez didn't recognize the reference to the classified Cold War program. It didn't matter. In approximately 12 minutes, the wind window would open, and she would either make history or join the list of pilots who had died attempting to prove that the impossible was possible. As she approached the western rim of Widow's Canyon, the full magnitude of the challenge before her became apparent. Devil's Gate was a jagged slash in the mountain wall barely 80 feet wide at its narrowest point. The Apache's rotor diameter was just under 50 feet, leaving less than 15 feet of clearance on either side, assuming she maintained perfect positioning throughout the approach. The storm system was moving in faster than predicted, dark clouds boiling over the mountain peaks. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the canyon walls in brief stark flashes that revealed the deadly terrain awaiting her. Nightshade actual weather update, Morgan requested, eyeing the approaching storm front. Storm accelerating, Sullivan confirmed, his voice tight with concern. Wind window may be compromised. Recommend abort and reassess. Morgan checked her fuel reserves and weapons systems. The nearest alternative landing zone was 30 minutes away. By the time she refueled and returned, the wind window would be long gone, and with it any chance of rescuing the trapped soldiers before Reynolds began executing them. Negative on abort, she replied firmly, proceeding as planned. She could almost hear Sullivan's resigned nod through the radio silence that followed. He understood the stakes as well as she did. Sometimes the only way forward was through. Morgan activated the Apache's defensive systems and armed the weapons pods. The M230 chain gun hummed to life, and the targeting computer confirmed all 16 Hellfire missiles were ready for deployment. She wouldn't have the luxury of a second approach if she encountered resistance, so the first strike needed to be decisive. Beginning final approach, she announced. Wind window opens in 7 minutes. The Apache descended toward the narrow opening, buffeted by increasingly violent crosswinds. Morgan compensated with subtle control adjustments, her hands steady on the cyclic and collective. Years of simulator training combined with Sullivan's unorthodox techniques allowed her to read the air currents through the vibrations in the airframe, feeling the mountain's breath like an extension of her own body. 5 minutes to window, Sullivan updated. Wind shear intensifying at the entrance. You'll need to thread the needle, Hawk. Morgan's focus narrowed to the task at hand. The canyon walls loomed larger as she approached their jagged edges, promising swift destruction for any pilot who miscalculated. But where others saw an impassable barrier, she saw a series of reference points that she'd memorized from countless hours studying topographical maps and satellite imagery. The jutting rock formation to the left, Widow's Thumb, she'd named it, marked the exact entry point where the wind currents would stabilize momentarily. The hanging outcropping to the right, Devil's Horn, created a unique pressure system that would push against the Apache's port side upon entry. 3 minutes to window, Sullivan's voice was calm but tense. Black River communications indicate they've detected an aircraft approaching the canyon. They're scrambling to identify. Morgan smiled grimly. Reynolds had prepared for every conventional approach, positioned his forces to counter standard military doctrine. But he hadn't considered Devil's Gate because no sane pilot would attempt it. 2 minutes, wind patterns aligning. You're going to have exactly 72 seconds of optimal conditions. Morgan brought the Apache into position, hovering just outside the narrow entrance. The helicopter swayed in the gusting winds, but she held it steady, watching her instruments as the seconds counted down. 1 minute. Stand by. Wind shear decreasing. Vertical currents stabilizing. Morgan took a deep breath, centering herself for what came next. This was the moment that would define her career and determine whether 87 American soldiers lived or died. Wind window opening. Now go, Hawk. Morgan pushed the Apache forward, diving into the narrow passage between the towering cliff walls. Immediately, the crosswinds caught the rotor, trying to slam the helicopter sideways. She countered with precise control inputs, using the techniques Sullivan had taught her, techniques that had been purged from official training manuals after Operation Nightshade was shut down. The Apache threaded through the narrowest section of Devil's Gate rotors, clearing the jagged walls by mere feet on either side. The wind pattern shifted exactly as Morgan had predicted, creating a tunnel of relatively stable air that carried the helicopter deeper into the canyon. I'm through the gate, she reported, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Proceeding to Phase 2. As the canyon widened slightly, Morgan brought the Apache into a nap of the earth flight profile, using the terrain for concealment as she approached the first Black River position. Her thermal imaging showed 3 anti-aircraft emplacements positioned along the ridgelines, their operators unaware of her approach from the supposedly impassable western corridor. Morgan selected her first target, the central emplacement that controlled the largest field of fire. She brought the Apache into attack position, the targeting computer locking onto the heat signatures of the Black River operators. Engaging hostiles. She transmitted, then squeezed the trigger. The M230 chain gun spoke with lethal authority, sending a stream of 30mm rounds into the emplacement. The position erupted in a fireball that illuminated the canyon walls, eliminating the threat before the operators could respond. The other 2 emplacements reacted immediately, swiveling toward the unexpected threat. But Morgan was already moving, using the terrain features she'd memorized to mask her approach to the second position. A Hellfire missile streaked from the Apache's weapons pod, striking the anti-aircraft gun with pinpoint precision. The third emplacement managed to get off a single burst of fire that went wide, missing the Apache by yards. Morgan responded with another burst from the chain gun, silencing the position permanently. In less than 40 seconds, she had eliminated 3 anti-aircraft positions that had successfully repelled 2 previous rescue attempts. The element of surprise, combined with her intimate knowledge of the terrain, had given her an advantage that no amount of conventional firepower could match. "First phase complete," she reported, proceeding to Thunder's position. Sullivan's voice came through tense with excitement. "Confirmed, 3 hostiles, neutralized. Black River comms indicate total confusion. They have no idea where you came from." Morgan allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before focusing on the next objective. Rodriguez was still in danger, and the 847 Rangers remained trapped throughout the canyon's system. As she navigated deeper into Widow's Canyon, the full scope of the Black River operation became apparent. They had established a sophisticated command center in the central basin, with communications equipment, weapons caches, and what appeared to be a makeshift prison area where several Rangers were being held. And standing in the center of it all, clearly visible on her thermal imaging, was James Reynolds, the man responsible for the entire crisis. Unlike the grainy surveillance photos in person, Reynolds cut an imposing figure despite his age. His military bearing was unmistakable as he moved among his subordinates, directing their operations with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime in combat zones. Through her targeting scope, Morgan could see the scars on the right side of his face, remnants of his time in Iraqi captivity, a physical reminder of Harmon's betrayal. Morgan considered her options. Taking out Reynolds immediately would decapitate the Black River operation, potentially causing enough confusion for the Rangers to overwhelm their captors. But Rodriguez was in immediate danger, and Colonel Harmon was somewhere in the canyon as well. The decision was made for her when her radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "Hawk, this is Thunder. They found me. Multiple hostiles converging on my position. I can't hold them off much longer." Morgan banked the Apache toward Rodriguez's coordinates. "Hold tight, Thunder. Inbound hot." She pushed the helicopter to maximum speed, skimming just above the canyon floor to avoid detection for as long as possible. Her thermal imaging showed 8 hostile figures surrounding a small rock formation where Rodriguez had taken shelter. They were closing in, preparing for a final assault. Morgan brought the Apache up and over a ridge, revealing herself to the Black River operatives below. The element of surprise gave her a critical advantage. She had target lock and was firing before they could bring their weapons to bear. The chain gun tore through the exposed hostiles, forcing the survivors to scatter for cover. Morgan positioned the Apache between the remaining operatives and Rodriguez's position, using the helicopter as a shield while she systematically eliminated the threat. "Clear to move, Thunder," she transmitted once the last hostile was down. Rodriguez emerged from his hiding place, his flight suit torn and bloodied, but moving under his own power. He stared up at the Apache with clear disbelief, recognizing the call sign painted on the fuselage. "Morgan, how the hell did you get in here?" "I'll explain later," she replied, scanning for a suitable extraction point. "Can you make it to that clearing 50 meters to your east? I need to get you airborne before Black River regroups." Rodriguez gave a shaky thumbs up and began moving toward the designated area. Morgan kept the Apache in a protective hover sensors, sweeping for any additional threats. Nightshade actual requesting status update on Ranger positions. She transmitted while waiting for Rodriguez to reach the clearing. Sullivan's response was immediate. "Rangers are scattered throughout the canyon. Largest concentration is with Colonel Harmon at grid reference 2227-344. They've established a defensive perimeter, but are running low on ammunition. Black River forces are massing for an assault. Morgan checked the coordinates. Harmon and the Rangers were approximately 3 minutes away, at maximum speed in the eastern section of the canyon. She could extract Rodriguez first, then proceed to their position. As Rodriguez reached the clearing, Morgan brought the Apache down in a combat landing, keeping the rotor spinning as the wounded pilot climbed aboard. "Nice of you to drop in," Rodriguez managed through gritted teeth as he strapped into the co-pilot's seat. "Don't get comfortable," Morgan replied, already lifting off. "We've got more people to save." The Apache rose from the clearing just as alarm indicators flashed across Morgan's console. Radar warning receivers detected multiple targeting locks from the direction of the Black River Command Center. "Missile launch evading," she announced, throwing the Apache into a hard banking turn as surface-to-air missiles streaked toward their position. Morgan deployed countermeasures and pulled the helicopter into a tight spiral between two towering rock formations. The first missile lost tracking and impacted against the canyon wall. The second followed them through the turn, but couldn't match the Apache's maneuverability in the confined space, detonating harmlessly behind them. "They've got our signature now," Rodriguez warned, checking the tactical display. "Reynolds is redirecting all his forces to intercept us." Morgan nodded grimly. The element of surprise was gone. Now it was a race against time to reach Harmon and the Rangers before Black River could consolidate their forces. As they approached the eastern section, Morgan's radio crackled with a new transmission. Colonel Harmon's voice strained but determined. "Unknown aircraft, identify yourself immediately. You are entering a hot combat zone." "Colonel, this is Captain Morgan. I have Thunder aboard and am inbound to your position for extraction support." A lengthy pause followed then. "Morgan, how did you— never mind. We're in a defensive position at the base of the eastern ridge. Black River forces are closing in from 3 directions. We have wounded and are low on ammunition." "Copy that, sir. ETA 2 minutes, preparing for close air support." Morgan could almost feel Harmon's struggle to process her unexpected arrival through the silence that followed. Finally, he responded with simple military precision. "Acknowledged, marking our position with green smoke. Be advised, Black River has heavy weapons on the northern approach." "Understood. Stand by for danger close." Morgan brought the Apache toward the coordinates, spotting the green smoke rising from a rocky outcropping where the Rangers had established their defensive position. Her thermal imaging showed the Black River forces closing in at least 60 hostile combatants, approaching from multiple directions. "They're in a bad spot," Rodriguez observed, studying the tactical display. "No good extraction point, and those cliffs at their back mean they're trapped." Morgan assessed the situation quickly. "We can't extract them all at once. We need to create a corridor for them to move to a better position." She identified the heaviest concentration of Black River forces on the northern approach, the heavy weapons Harmon had mentioned. Taking those out first would open an escape route toward the central canyon where evacuation would be possible. "Colonel, I'm engaging hostiles to your north. Once they're neutralized, move your people toward the central basin. There's a clearing large enough for multiple helicopters approximately 1 kilometer from your position." "Copy that. Standing by." Morgan brought the Apache into attack position, selecting Hellfire missiles for the initial strike against the heavy weapons emplacements. The targeting computer acquired multiple locks, and she unleashed 4 missiles in rapid succession. The northern ridgeline erupted in a series of explosions as the precision munitions found their targets. The Black River forces scattered their coordinated advance, disintegrating under the unexpected air attack. Morgan followed with a strafing run, using the chain gun, creating a path of devastation through the remaining hostiles. In less than a minute, the northern approach was clear. "Northern route secured," she reported. "Move your people now, Colonel." Through her thermal imaging, Morgan watched as the Rangers began their organized withdrawal, moving wounded personnel first while combat teams provided covering fire. Harmon was visible at the center of the formation, directing the operation with practiced efficiency despite his own injuries. "Eastern and western approaches still hot," Rodriguez warned, monitoring the tactical display. "Black River regrouping." Morgan banked the Apache toward the eastern threat, preparing to repeat the process. But before she could engage, the tactical situation changed dramatically. "Multiple aircraft detected," Sullivan's voice came through the radio. "Black River has deployed their own air assets." Morgan checked her radar, confirming 3 incoming helicopters, not military models, but heavily modified civilian aircraft retrofitted with weapon systems. Reynolds was playing his trump card. "Colonel, expedite your movement," she transmitted urgently. "We have incoming hostiles." "Moving as fast as we can with the wounded," Harmon replied. "ETA to Central Basin is 7 minutes. Too long. The Black River helicopters would be on them in less than 3. Morgan made a split-second decision. "Thunder, take the controls. Get to the colonel's position and provide close support." Rodriguez looked at her in confusion. "What are you going to do, Harmon? Buy you time?" Morgan was already unstrapping from her seat. "I'm better in the gunner position for what comes next. Take the controls." They switched positions smoothly, the transition practice from countless training exercises. Rodriguez took over the flight controls while Morgan moved to the gunner station, taking manual control of the weapon systems. "Those aren't military pilots," she explained, calibrating the targeting system. "They're mercenaries with modified equipment. They'll have the advantage in numbers, but we have superior training and technology." Rodriguez nodded, understanding her strategy. "I'll keep us positioned between them and the Rangers." The first Black River helicopter appeared around the eastern ridge, a civilian Bell model modified with door-mounted machine guns. It was followed closely by 2 more, forming a hunting formation as they swept into the canyon. "Let them get closer," Morgan instructed, her finger hovering over the trigger. "I want them committed to their approach." Rodriguez held the Apache steady, presenting what appeared to be an easy target. The lead Black River helicopter accelerated its door gunner, opening fire with a heavy machine gun that sent tracer rounds streaking past them. "Now," Morgan called. Rodriguez executed a perfect combat maneuver, dropping the Apache into a shallow dive before pulling up sharply. The sudden change in position disoriented the attacking pilot, causing his next burst to go wide. Morgan seized the advantage, acquiring target lock on the lead helicopter and firing a precisely aimed burst from the chain gun. The rounds tore through the civilian aircraft's unarmored cockpit, sending it spinning out of control to crash against the canyon wall. The 2 remaining helicopters broke formation, attempting to flank the Apache from both sides. Rodriguez anticipated the maneuver, positioning their aircraft to keep both hostiles in Morgan's field of fire. "They're trying to box us in," he warned, executing a series of evasive maneuvers that kept the Apache moving unpredictably. "Let them try," Morgan replied, swinging the targeting system toward the eastern helicopter. She fired another burst, striking the aircraft's tail rotor. The helicopter began to spin uncontrollably, its pilot fighting to maintain altitude as it drifted toward the canyon floor. It didn't crash, but it was effectively out of the fight. The third helicopter broke off its attack, retreating toward the Black River Command Center. Morgan allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before returning her attention to the Rangers' movement. Through her thermal imaging, she could see they had covered approximately half the distance to the extraction point. Harmon was still leading from the center, coordinating the wounded and maintaining defensive positions as they moved. "Colonel, status report," she requested. 3 minutes to extraction point," Harmon replied. "Black River forces regrouping to our south. We're moving as fast as we can." Morgan was about to respond when Sullivan's urgent transmission cut in. "Hawk, be advised. Black River has activated some kind of experimental weapon. Energy signature unlike anything I've seen before." Before Morgan could process this warning, the blinding beam of coherent light sliced through the air beside the Apache, missing by mere yards. The canyon wall where it struck glowed red-hot, molten rock sliding down the cliff face. "What the hell was that?" Rodriguez exclaimed, banking hard away from the attack. Morgan's tactical display identified the source, a vehicle-mounted system at the Black River Command Center. "Directed energy weapon, some kind of military prototype." She checked their defensive systems. "Our countermeasures won't work against it." Another beam lanced toward them, forcing Rodriguez into a desperate and evasive maneuver that strained the Apache's airframe to its limits. The helicopter shuddered under the stress, warning indicators flashing across the console. "We can't keep this up," Rodriguez warned. "One direct hit from that thing, and we're done." Morgan studied the tactical display, identifying the weapon's position. It was heavily defended, surrounded by Black River's remaining forces, with Reynolds himself coordinating the defense. A plan formed in her mind, dangerous, possibly suicidal, but their only chance to complete the mission. "Get to the Rangers," she instructed Rodriguez. "Extract as many as you can while I neutralize that weapon." "You want to split up?" "That's crazy, Morgan. That weapon will shoot down any evacuation attempt unless I take it out." Her tone left no room for argument. "Land at the next clearing. I'm going in on foot." Rodriguez looked like he wanted to protest further, but recognized the tactical necessity. He brought the Apache down in a small clearing approximately 400 meters from the Ranger's position. "I'll hold here for 5 minutes," he said as Morgan prepared to disembark. "If you're not back by then, I'm coming after you." Morgan nodded, checking her sidearm, Sullivan's old service pistol, and the combat knife strapped to her flight suit. "Just get those Rangers out. That's the mission." She dropped from the Apache and moved immediately into cover, using the terrain features she'd memorized to navigate toward the Black River Command Center. The directed energy weapon fired again, targeting Rodriguez as he lifted off, but he executed a perfect evasive maneuver that carried him safely toward the Ranger's position. Morgan advanced through the rugged terrain, using the shadows cast by the setting sun to conceal her approach. The Black River Command Center was less than 800 meters away, situated on a raised plateau in the central basin. The directed energy weapon was mounted on a modified truck at the center of the compound, surrounded by defensive positions. And standing next to it, clearly visible through her compact binoculars, was James Reynolds, the architect of this entire crisis. Morgan assessed her options. A frontal assault was suicide. The defensive positions were too well established, and she was outnumbered at least 20-1. But she had one advantage: they didn't expect intimate knowledge of the terrain. During her months of studying Widow's Canyon, Morgan had identified a network of narrow passages and crevices that ran beneath much of the canyon floor, ancient waterways that had carved through the softer rock layers. One such passage ran directly beneath the plateau where Reynolds had established his command center. Morgan located the entrance to the passage, a narrow fissure in the canyon wall that most would overlook. She squeezed through the opening, finding herself in a tight corridor of smooth stone. Her flashlight revealed a path forward barely wide enough for a person to traverse in a crouched position. She moved quickly through the passage, navigating by memory from the geological surveys she'd studied. The air grew increasingly stale as she progressed deeper, suggesting limited ventilation and limited knowledge of these passages by those above. After approximately 10 minutes of careful movement, Morgan reached a point where her calculations indicated she was directly beneath the Black River Command Center. A narrow chimney in the rock led upward, potentially providing access to the surface. She began to climb using natural handholds in the rock wall. The chimney widened slightly as she ascended, eventually opening into what appeared to be a drainage culvert beneath the plateau. Above her, a metal grate separated the culvert from the surface. Through the grate, Morgan could see the underside of vehicles and the boots of Black River personnel moving about. She had successfully infiltrated the heart of their operation. Carefully, she tested the grate. It was old and corroded, designed for drainage rather than security. With a controlled application of force, she was able to lift it just enough to slide it aside, creating an opening large enough to squeeze through. Morgan emerged behind a supply truck, using it for concealment as she oriented herself. The directed energy weapon was approximately 50 meters away, still firing periodically at the Apache, which Rodriguez was using to draw attention away from the Ranger's movement. Between her position and the weapon were multiple Black River operatives, all focused outward on the perceived threat. None expected an attack from within their perimeter. Morgan formulated her plan quickly. The weapon itself was her primary target, but its power source, a series of generators positioned nearby, presented a more vulnerable target. Destroy those and the weapon would be useless. She moved from cover to cover, using the chaotic activity of the compound to mask her approach. Black River personnel were rushing to defensive positions, responding to reports of the Rangers' movement toward the extraction point. No one noticed the lone figure slipping between vehicles and equipment. Morgan reached the generators without being detected. She examined them quickly, identifying the fuel lines and control systems. A well-placed shot to the fuel distribution manifold would create a catastrophic failure and likely a significant explosion. As she drew Sullivan's pistol, a voice from behind froze her in place. "I'm impressed, Captain Morgan. Truly." She turned slowly to find James Reynolds standing 10 feet away, a pistol aimed casually at her chest. His steel gray hair and weathered face matched the intelligence photos, but his eyes held a coldness that no image could capture. The scars on his face were more pronounced up close, a web of damaged tissue running from his right temple down to his jaw. "Devil's Gate," he continued conversationally. "I didn't think anyone could fly through that death trap. Harmon certainly couldn't have done it." Morgan kept her weapon lowered, mind racing for options. "You know my name." Reynolds smiled thinly. "Of course. I make it my business to know everything about potential adversaries. The emotional pilot who cares too much. The one Harmon sidelined because he thought you lacked the killer instinct. His smile widened. Ironic that you're the only one who made it through my defenses. This ends now, Reynolds. Your men are being neutralized and the Rangers are being evacuated as we speak. Perhaps, Reynolds shrugged, but Harmon will still die today. That was always the primary objective. His expression hardened. He left me to rot in an Iraqi prison for 3 years. Do you know what happens to American operatives in those places, Captain? Reynolds pulled down the collar of his tactical shirt, revealing a network of burn scars that could only have come from systematic torture. I was interrogated by Iraqi intelligence for 6 months before they realized I wouldn't break. Then they simply forgot about me, left me in a 6x8 cell to die slowly. I survived by planning exactly how I would repay the debt to the man who abandoned me. His eyes burned with an intensity that made Morgan realize this was far more than a simple military operation for Reynolds. This was the culmination of decades of pain and planning. Harmon had a choice, Reynolds continued. He could have attempted extraction. The risks were acceptable. Instead, he chose his career over his men, over me. He gestured toward the canyon where the Rangers were being evacuated. Now he'll understand what it feels like to be left behind. Morgan saw movement at the corner of her vision. Black River operatives becoming aware of her presence, moving to surround her. Time was running out. You know what your problem is, Captain Reynolds continued. You're exactly what Harmon accused you of being too emotionally invested. A true combat pilot would have taken the shot when she had the chance, regardless of the risk. Morgan met his gaze steadily. You're right about one thing. I am emotionally invested. Her finger tightened almost imperceptibly on her trigger. That's why I won't miss. In a single fluid motion, Morgan raised her weapon and fired not at Reynolds but at the fuel manifold behind him. The bullet struck with precision, puncturing the pressurized system. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Fuel sprayed into the air, igniting on contact with the hot generator components. The resulting explosion threw Reynolds forward, knocking him to the ground as flames engulfed the power system. Morgan was already moving, diving behind a concrete barrier as the directed energy weapon went dark, its power supply obliterated. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition stores cooked off in the spreading fire. The Black River compound descended into chaos. Personnel scattered, abandoning their positions as the command center became an inferno. Morgan used the confusion to make her escape, working her way toward the extraction point where Rodriguez would be evacuating the Rangers. Through gaps in the smoke, she could see Reynolds being dragged to safety by his men, injured but alive. Their eyes met briefly across the burning compound, a moment of recognition between adversaries. Then he was gone, swallowed by the smoke and confusion. Morgan didn't waste time on pursuit. The mission was to save the Rangers, not to capture Reynolds. She moved quickly through the chaos, evading the disorganized Black River forces as she made her way toward the extraction point. As she crested a ridge overlooking the central basin, Morgan saw the Apache hovering above a clearing where Rangers were boarding in groups. Rodriguez was executing a textbook evacuation, touching down just long enough for soldiers to climb aboard before lifting off to deposit them at a safer location further west. She keyed her radio. Thunder, this is Hawk. Target neutralized. What's your status? Rodriguez's relieved voice came through immediately. Hawk, I thought you were dead. We've evacuated approximately 1/3 of the Rangers. Colonel Harmon is coordinating the ground movement. Any sign of Black River reinforcements? Negative. They seem to be in full retreat after whatever you did to their command center. That was one hell of an explosion. Morgan allowed herself a small smile, just a little emotional investment in the outcome. She continued toward the extraction point, reaching the perimeter where Rangers had established defensive positions covering the evacuation. Colonel Harmon was at the center of the operation despite his obvious injuries. He looked up as Morgan approached, his expression unreadable. Captain Morgan, he acknowledged, his voice carefully neutral. Unorthodox tactics. Yes, sir. Effective, though. Harmon gestured toward the burning Black River Command Center. Reynolds, injured but alive. His forces are in disarray. Harmon nodded, something shifting in his eyes as he reassessed the pilot he'd kept grounded for so long. Your approach through Devil's Gate, that wasn't in any flight manual I've ever seen. No, sir, it wasn't. A wounded ranger called for Harmon's attention, sparing Morgan from further explanation. She moved to assist with the evacuation, helping soldiers board the Apache as Rodriguez returned for another group. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, Morgan surveyed the operation she'd made possible. Hundreds of rangers already evacuated, with the remainder organized for efficient extraction. The Black River threat neutralized their command structure in ruins, all accomplished by the pilot they said cared too much to be effective in combat. Sullivan's voice came through her radio, quiet but filled with pride. "Hawk, this is Nightshade Actual. Base Command is mobilizing all available transport for evacuation support. ETA 15 minutes. Morgan looked up at the darkening sky where the storm had begun to dissipate, as if nature itself acknowledged the changing tide of battle. "Copy that, Nightshade Actual. We'll be ready." "Well done, Captain," Sullivan added softly. "You proved them wrong today." Morgan watched as Rodriguez landed the Apache for another extraction run, the Rangers moving with renewed hope and purpose towards salvation that hours earlier had seemed impossible. "No," she replied, understanding now what Sullivan had been trying to teach her all along. "I proved them right. I do care too much." She looked toward the burning Black River compound, where her emotional investment had transformed into the precise tactical judgment that saved lives. "That's what makes me dangerous." The mission wasn't over. Reynolds was still out there, injured but alive. Hundreds of Rangers still needed evacuation. The storm might return, and the night was young. But for the first time since she had earned her wings, Captain Alexis Morgan knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, in the heart of impossible odds, caring too much to fail. Darkness had fully descended on Widow's Canyon as Captain Alexis Morgan helped the last group of wounded Rangers board Rodriguez's Apache. The evacuation operation had been underway for nearly 2 hours, with Rodriguez making multiple trips to ferry soldiers to the secure landing zone they'd established 3 miles west. The burning remnants of the Black River Command Center cast an orange glow across the canyon walls, illuminating the battlefield in a hellish light. Nearly 600 Rangers had already been evacuated, but more than 200 remained, including the most severely wounded in the defensive perimeter teams. Colonel Victor Harmon stood at the edge of the landing zone, his face illuminated by the tactical display of a satellite radio. Despite his own injuries, a deep gash across his forehead, and what appeared to be a broken arm, hastily splinted with field equipment, he maintained the commanding presence that had defined his career. "Base, this is Granite Leader," he transmitted. "We have approximately 200 personnel still awaiting extraction, requesting status update on inbound transport." The reply came through with reassuring clarity. "Granite Leader, this is Command. 4 Blackhawks and 2 Chinooks are inbound to your position. ETA 12 minutes. Morgan approached as Harmon acknowledged the transmission. He turned to her, his expression a complex mixture of grudging respect and professional assessment. "Your Apache pilot is one hell of a flyer," he said, nodding toward Rodriguez, who was lifting off with another load of Rangers. "Though not as good as you." Morgan maintained her professional demeanor despite the unexpected compliment. "Thank you, sir. Captain Rodriguez is an excellent pilot. He's maximizing extraction efficiency by "Cut the technical assessment, Morgan," Harmon interrupted, his voice softening slightly. "I've spent 3 years keeping you grounded because I thought you were too emotional for combat operations. Today you proved me wrong in the most spectacular fashion possible." Before Morgan could respond, Sullivan's urgent voice came through her radio. "Hawk, this is Nightshade Actual. Black River forces regrouping approximately 2 kilometers east of your position. Thermal imaging shows multiple vehicles moving toward you." Morgan keyed her mic. "Copy that, Nightshade. Estimate force strength and composition. At least 40 personnel, 3 armored vehicles. And Morgan, Reynolds is with them. He survived the explosion." A cold certainty settled in Morgan's chest. Reynolds wasn't retreating, he was making a final push to complete his original mission. To kill Harmon regardless of collateral damage. "Colonel," she said, turning to Harmon, "Black River is mounting a counterattack. We need to accelerate the evacuation." Harmon's expression hardened as he processed this information. "The remaining wounded can't be moved any faster, and we're still 12 minutes from reinforcements." For a moment, a haunted look crossed Harmon's face. "Reynolds won't stop," he said quietly. "Not until one of us is dead." "Sir," Morgan questioned, sensing there was more to the story than Mitchell had shared. Harmon glanced around, ensuring no rangers were within earshot, then met her gaze directly. What do you know about the Al-Rashid mission in 91? Captain Mitchell mentioned you and Reynolds were on a deep reconnaissance mission during Desert Storm. His position was compromised, and you made the call to abort rather than attempt rescue. Harmon's jaw tightened. That's the sanitized version. He looked away toward the eastern horizon where Reynolds was preparing his final assault. The truth is, I knew the risks when I sent him in. Intelligence had indicated a trap, but we needed confirmation on suspected chemical weapons. I ordered Reynolds to continue alone while I maintained overwatch. When Iraqi forces surrounded his position, I had a clear shot at their commander, a kill that might have created enough confusion for Reynolds to escape. Harmon's voice grew strained, but taking that shot would have revealed my position, compromising the entire mission and the intelligence we'd gathered. You chose the mission over the man, Morgan said quietly, understanding dawning. I chose what I thought was the greater good, Harmon corrected, the weight of decades-old guilt evident in his tone. I reported that Reynolds had been killed in action, never expecting he'd survive Iraqi captivity. When he reappeared 7 years later, I was already a colonel. The official investigation concluded I'd made the tactically correct decision. But Reynolds knew otherwise. He knew I'd abandoned him for a promotion and a medal. Harmon's gaze returned to the eastern approach, and now he's coming to collect what he believes I owe him. Morgan assessed their tactical situation quickly. The defensive perimeter was stretched thin with Rangers exhausted from hours of combat. Their ammunition was limited, and they had no heavy weapons to counter armored vehicles. They could attempt to withdraw farther west, but moving the wounded would slow them down, making them vulnerable to pursuit. Sir, I recommend we hold this position, she said decisively. Its defensible offers clear fields of fire and keeps us within range of the extraction point. If we can delay Black River for 12 minutes, we win. Harmon studied her for a moment, then nodded. Agreed. Take command of the eastern defensive line. I'll coordinate the northern and southern positions. The simple instruction carried profound significance. Harmon was entrusting her with tactical command in a combat situation, something he had previously deemed her incapable of handling. Morgan moved immediately to the eastern perimeter, where 30 Rangers had established defensive positions behind natural rock formations. Among them was Lieutenant Jenkins, one of the pilots who had accompanied Williams and Rodriguez on the original mission. Captain Morgan, Jenkins greeted her with surprised respect. Hell of a day when the base taxi driver turns out to be our guardian angel. Morgan allowed herself a brief smile at the reference to her previous assignment running transport missions. Status report, Lieutenant. We've got 30 effectives, mostly light weapons. 2 saws with limited ammunition, 4 grenades, and a lot of determination. Jenkins gestured toward the eastern approach. That open ground gives us good visibility, but limited cover if they push through with vehicles. Morgan studied the terrain carefully. The eastern approach consisted of a gradual slope leading up to their position, with scattered boulders and shallow depressions providing minimal cover. It was a killing field for infantry, but those armored vehicles would change the equation significantly. We need to create a choke point, she decided, pointing to a narrow section where the path threaded between 2 large rock formations. Those boulders are our best chance to stop the vehicles. Jenkins followed her reasoning immediately. The grenades, if we could trigger a rock slide. Exactly. Morgan keyed her radio. Nightshade actual, this is Hawk. Need precise coordinates on those vehicles. We're setting up an ambush. Sullivan's response was immediate. Vehicles advancing in column formation along the eastern access road. Lead vehicle is approaching grid reference 337289. Estimate arrival at your position in 7 minutes. 7 minutes to prepare an ambush that would stop a determined enemy with superior firepower. Morgan moved with practiced efficiency, directing Rangers to optimal firing positions, while 2 demolition specialists worked to place the grenades for maximum effect. We get 1 shot at this, she told the assembled soldiers. When the lead vehicle reaches the choke point, we trigger the rock slide. That should disable at least 1 vehicle and block the path for the others. Then we concentrate fire on any personnel who exit the vehicles. The Rangers nodded, their faces set with grim determination. These were elite soldiers trained for precisely this kind of desperate situation. Despite hours of combat and the strain of what had seemed like certain death, they moved with professional precision, to implement Morgan's plan. As they finished their preparations, Morgan's radio crackled with Rodriguez's voice. "Hawk, this is Thunder. I've delivered the last group to the secure LZ. Returning to your position. ETA 3 minutes." Morgan did a quick calculation. The Apache's weapon systems were nearly depleted, but its presence alone would provide a significant tactical advantage. "Copy that, Thunder. We have hostiles approaching from the east. Your air support will be critical." With the defensive preparations complete, Morgan took a position at the center of the line where she could observe the entire approach and adjust their response as needed. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, the distant rumble of engines growing steadily louder. "First vehicle in sight," reported a ranger on the forward observation post. "Approaching the choke point in 30 seconds. Morgan raised her binoculars, focusing on the narrow passage between the rock formations. The lead vehicle was a modified Humvee with improvised armor plating and a mounted heavy machine gun. Behind it came 2 more armored vehicles, their profiles suggesting civilian models converted for military use. "Stand by," she ordered as the lead vehicle entered the choke point. "On my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark." The demolition specialist triggered the detonator. 4 grenades exploded simultaneously, their force amplified by careful placement within the rock formation. The effect was immediate and devastating. Tons of rock cascaded down onto the lead vehicle, crushing its front section and blocking the path completely. The Rangers opened fire as Black River personnel spilled from the damaged vehicle, catching them in a deadly crossfire. Within seconds, the ambush had eliminated half a dozen hostiles and completely disrupted their advance. But Black River responded with professional precision. The trailing vehicles deployed their personnel in a flanking maneuver, using the terrain for cover as they established firing positions. Heavy machine gun fire raked the Ranger positions, forcing defenders to keep their heads down. "They're trying to work around to our southern flank," Jenkins called over the gunfire. "If they get established there, they'll have an angle on our wounded." Morgan assessed the situation quickly. The Black River forces were adapting to the ambush, using superior firepower to pin down the defenders while maneuvering into position for a decisive strike. Without intervention, they would overwhelm the perimeter within minutes. The distinctive sound of an Apache's rotors cut through the gunfire as Rodriguez arrived overhead. Morgan keyed her radio. "Thunder, this is Hawk. We need suppressing fire on the southern approach. Black River forces attempting to flank our position." "Copy that, Hawk. I see them." The Apache banked sharply, bringing its weapon systems to bear on the southern flank. The chain gun opened fire, its distinctive roar drowning out all other sounds as it rained devastation on the Black River positions. The flanking maneuver collapsed as hostiles scrambled for cover from the aerial assault. Morgan used the opportunity to reposition her defenders, strengthening the southern section of the perimeter. The Apache's intervention had bought them precious minutes, but the tactical situation remained precarious. Black River still had numerical superiority and heavier weapons. Through her binoculars, Morgan caught a glimpse of a figure directing the Black River forces from behind the second vehicle, James Reynolds. He had survived the destruction of the command center, his face partially bandaged, but his determination undiminished. As if sensing her observation, Reynolds looked directly toward her position. Even at this distance, Morgan could feel the cold intensity of his gaze. This wasn't just a military operation for him anymore, it was personal. "Hawk, be advised," Sullivan's voice came through with urgent clarity. "Thermal imaging shows Black River deploying a backup directed energy weapon. Same signature as the one you destroyed earlier." Morgan felt a chill run through her. The directed energy weapon had nearly shot down Rodriguez earlier, and now they were bringing another one into play. With the Apache providing their only air support, losing it would be catastrophic. "Thunder, pull back immediately," she ordered. "They've got another laser weapon." "Too late for that," Rodriguez replied, his voice tight with concentration. "They've got a lock on me. I need to keep moving or they'll take me down." Morgan watched as the Apache executed a series of evasive maneuvers, staying just ahead of the deadly energy beam that sliced through the air in its wake. Rodriguez was flying brilliantly, but he couldn't keep dodging forever. "Base, what's the ETA on those reinforcements?" she demanded. 7 minutes out, came the response from command. "Weather conditions are slowing their approach." 7 minutes. They needed to neutralize that energy weapon now, or Rodriguez would be shot down and their perimeter overrun before reinforcements arrived. Morgan made a decision. "Jenkins, you have tactical command of the eastern perimeter. I'm going to take out that weapon. By yourself, Jenkins looked at her in disbelief. That's suicide, Captain. Not if I have proper distraction. Morgan keyed her radio again. Thunder, I need you to make a lot of noise on the northern approach. Draw their attention away from the south. I'm going after that weapon. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. Copy that. One loud distraction coming up. Good hunting, Hawk. The Apache banked away, circling toward the northern approach where it began a series of strafing runs that drew all eyes upward. Under cover of this distraction, Morgan slipped away from the defensive perimeter, using the terrain to conceal her movement as she circled toward the Black River position. Years of studying Widow's Canyon's topography guided her through the darkness, finding paths invisible to those unfamiliar with the terrain. Within minutes, she had worked her way behind the Black River forces approaching their position from the one direction they weren't watching. The directed energy weapon was mounted on the back of the third vehicle, its operators focused entirely on tracking the Apache as it continued its noisy distraction to the north. Reynolds stood nearby, directing the operation with cold efficiency. Morgan assessed her options quickly. She had Sullivan's pistol and a combat knife, but was facing at least a dozen armed hostiles. A frontal assault would be suicidal. She needed to use the same approach that had served her in the command center's surgical precision at the critical point. The weapon's power source was her primary target, a generator unit connected to the laser apparatus by heavy cables. Disable that, and the weapon would be useless. She moved silently closer, using the darkness and the distraction of the Apache to avoid detection. When she was within 30 meters of the target, she paused behind a boulder and surveyed the full battlefield. What she saw made her blood run cold. Beyond the Black River position, in a small ravine, partially hidden from view, lay a group of wounded rangers. At least a dozen men who must have been separated from the main force during the earlier firefight. They were completely exposed with no defensive positions and no cover. If the Black River forces discovered them, they would be slaughtered. Morgan's tactical display indicated the reinforcement helicopters were still 6 minutes out. Rodriguez couldn't maintain his distraction much longer before the energy weapon locked onto him. And now she faced an impossible choice: neutralize the weapon and save the Apache, or rescue the wounded rangers before they were discovered. Time slowed as Morgan processed her options. The laser weapon was the immediate threat. If it shot down Rodriguez, the entire extraction operation would be compromised, potentially costing hundreds of lives. But those wounded rangers would almost certainly die if she didn't get to them first. The military calculation was clear: the weapon was the priority target. The strategic value of the Apache outweighed a dozen wounded soldiers. It was the tactically correct decision, exactly the kind of cold calculus that Harmon had used when he abandoned Reynolds in Iraq. The very kind of calculation that Morgan had spent her career refusing to accept. "Thunder, be advised," she transmitted. "I've spotted wounded rangers in a ravine east of the Black River position. Approximately a dozen men defenseless. I'm moving to extract them." "What about the weapon?" Rodriguez asked, his voice strained as he executed another evasive maneuver. "You'll have to keep dancing a little longer," Morgan replied. "I'm not leaving those men behind." She could almost hear Sullivan's silent approval through the radio. This was why they had chosen her for Operation Nightshade's revival, not despite her emotional investment, but because of it. Morgan altered her course, working her way toward the wounded rangers while remaining hidden from Black River's sentries. As she reached the edge of the ravine, she could see the soldiers more clearly, some unconscious, others alert, but too injured to move under their own power. "I'm Captain Morgan," she whispered to the nearest conscious ranger, a sergeant with a severe leg wound. "We need to move these men immediately. Black River forces are less than 100 meters away." The sergeant nodded, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes alert. "We've been monitoring their radio transmissions. They're planning to sweep this sector once they take down the Apache." Morgan assessed the situation rapidly. "Can any of you walk? 5 of us can move under our own power. The other 7 need assistance." Morgan calculated distances and time frames. "There's a depression about 200 meters west that offers concealment. If we can get there, we should be able to hold until reinforcements arrive." The mobile rangers began helping their wounded comrades using improvised stretchers made from combat vests and rifles. Morgan took point, guiding them along a route that used the terrain to shield their movement from Black River's position. The sergeant limped alongside her, his voice low. "We heard what you did, Captain, flying through Devil's Gate to get to us. Command said that was impossible. Nothing's impossible when lives are at stake, Morgan replied, her attention divided between their path and the Black River forces still focused on Rodriguez's Apache. They had covered approximately half the distance to the depression when Sullivan's urgent transmission cut through. Hawk, be advised, Black River has locked onto Thunder's position. Weapon firing in 10 seconds. Morgan froze, watching helplessly as the directed energy weapon swiveled to track Rodriguez's latest evasive maneuver. The Apache had exhausted its countermeasures and Rodriguez had run out of unpredictable flight patterns. She was too far away to disable the weapon. Her choice to save the Rangers meant Rodriguez would pay the price. Just as the weapon's targeting system locked on, a blinding flash erupted from the Black River position, but not from the energy weapon. A massive explosion consumed the generator unit, sending debris and Black River personnel flying in all directions. Through the smoke and chaos, Morgan caught a glimpse of a familiar figure. Colonel Harmon, his broken arm still in its makeshift splint, standing where the generator had been moments before. Somehow he had slipped away from the command post and infiltrated the Black River position on his own. "Thunder weapon neutralized," came Harmon's voice over the radio, strained but steady. "Continue evacuation operations." "Colonel," Morgan transmitted, "what's your status?" There was no reply. Through her binoculars, Morgan could see Black River forces converging on Harmon's position. Despite having accomplished his mission, the colonel was now surrounded. Morgan made another split-second decision. "Sergeant, continue to the depression. I'm going after the colonel." "Captain, that's suicide," the sergeant protested. "They've got at least 20 men still active." "And they're focused on Harmon, not us," Morgan replied, already moving. "Get your people to safety. That's an order." She sprinted toward the Black River position, using the confusion from the explosion to approach undetected. Through gaps in the smoke, she could see Harmon being forced to his knees, surrounded by armed Black River operatives. And standing before him, his scarred face illuminated by the flames of the destroyed generator, was James Reynolds. "After all these years," Reynolds was saying, his voice carrying across the battlefield, "finally you understand what it feels like to be abandoned victor, to know that no help is coming." Harmon looked up at his former comrade, his expression resolute despite his precarious position. "I was wrong, James. I made the wrong call in Iraq. I've lived with that mistake every day since. And now you'll die for it," Reynolds replied, raising his pistol to Harmon's forehead. Morgan couldn't risk a shot, too many hostiles between her and the confrontation. Instead, she keyed her radio to the emergency frequency that all military personnel monitored. "All forces, this is Captain Morgan. Be advised, we have confirmed that Black River has deployed a stolen nuclear device in the eastern sector. Detonation imminent. Evacuate immediately. Repeat, nuclear device confirmed." The effect was instantaneous. Black River operators, professionals who understood the implications of being near a nuclear device, broke formation and began running toward their remaining vehicles. Reynolds, momentarily distracted by the sudden chaos, turned away from Harmon. It was the opening Morgan needed. She burst from cover, firing precise shots that dropped the two operators still flanking Harmon. Reaching the colonel, she hauled him to his feet and pulled him toward the nearest cover, an overturned supply truck. "Nuclear device?" Harmon asked incredulously as they ducked behind the truck. "Sometimes emotion makes for better tactics than cold calculation," Morgan replied, checking her remaining ammunition. Reynolds trained his men too well. They're professionals who won't die for his personal vendetta. Through gaps in the wreckage, they could see Reynolds shouting at his retreating forces, trying to restore order. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Even if they suspected Morgan's transmission was a ruse, no one was willing to take the chance. "We need to move," Morgan said, scanning for an escape route. "The reinforcement helicopters will be here in 2 minutes." As they prepared to make a run for it, a cold voice stopped them. "Going somewhere, Victor." Reynolds stood at the edge of their cover, his pistol trained on them. His men might have fled, but he remained focused on his singular purpose. "It's over, James," Harmon said, stepping slightly in front of Morgan. "Your men are gone. Our reinforcements are inbound. There's no scenario where you complete your mission and survive." "I never expected to survive," Reynolds replied, his voice eerily calm. "This was always a one-way operation." Morgan saw his finger tighten on the trigger and reacted instinctively, throwing herself at Harmon and knocking him aside as Reynolds fired. She felt the bullet graze her shoulder, tearing through her flight suit, but missing anything vital. Before Reynolds could fire again, the night sky erupted with light, as the reinforcement helicopters arrived, their powerful searchlights illuminating the battlefield. Minigun fire from the lead Black Hawk strafed the ground between Reynolds and his targets, forcing him to dive for cover. "This way," Morgan shouted, pulling Harmon toward the depression where she'd sent the wounded Rangers. They ran as the helicopters provided covering fire, keeping Reynolds pinned down. As they reached the relative safety of the depression, Morgan looked back to see Reynolds making a desperate run toward his last remaining vehicle. He almost made it before a precise burst from one of the Black Hawk's door gunners sent him sprawling to the ground. The battle for Widow's Canyon was over. The military hearing convened 3 days after the Widow's Canyon incident. Captain Morgan sat at attention in her dress uniform, facing a panel of senior officers, including General Crawford, the base commander, and representatives from Special Forces Command. Colonel Harmon testified first, providing a detailed account of the Black River incursion and the subsequent rescue operation. His description of Morgan's actions was meticulously factual, but contained an undercurrent of respect that hadn't been present in their previous interactions. Captain Morgan's decision to attempt the western approach through Devil's Gate, while technically in violation of standing orders, demonstrated exceptional judgment under extreme circumstances. Harmon concluded, her actions directly resulted in the rescue of 847 American soldiers who would otherwise have been lost. Captain Rodriguez followed, describing Morgan's exceptional flying skills and tactical judgment during the evacuation. His testimony emphasized the lives saved by her intervention, particularly her neutralization of the directed energy weapons that had threatened the entire operation. Master Sergeant Sullivan's testimony proved most surprising. He produced classified documents confirming the existence of Operation Nightshade and its experimental flight techniques that had been developed specifically for rescue missions in terrain deemed impassable by conventional standards. Operation Nightshade was never officially terminated, Sullivan explained to the panel. It was placed in inactive status pending future technological developments. Captain Morgan's application of these protocols represents exactly the scenario for which they were designed. The hearing lasted 6 hours, during which Morgan provided her own detailed account of the mission, from her decision to attempt the western approach to her final confrontation with Reynolds. She neither apologized for nor defended her actions, simply presenting the tactical reasoning behind each decision. As the hearing concluded, General Crawford addressed her directly. "Captain Morgan, your actions violated direct orders and military protocol. You commandeered an aircraft without authorization, entered a combat zone without clearance, and engaged hostile forces without tactical support." His stern expression suggested a severe reprimand was forthcoming. However, he continued, "Your actions also saved the lives of 847 American soldiers, captured a wanted terrorist, and recovered classified military technology that Black River had stolen." He glanced at the other panel members, who nodded in agreement. "The panel finds that while your methods were unorthodox, your mission was consistent with the highest traditions of military service. Furthermore, Master Sergeant Sullivan's testimony regarding Operation Nightshade provides sufficient procedural coverage for your actions." Morgan maintained her professional composure despite her surprise at this outcome. "You will be reassigned effective immediately," Crawford continued. "Report to Hangar 7 at 800 tomorrow for your new posting. Dismissed." Hangar 7 was located in a remote section of the base, its entrance guarded by security personnel with special operations insignia. Morgan presented her credentials and was escorted inside, where she found an unexpected welcoming committee. Colonel Harmon stood at the center, his arms still in a cast, but his posture as commanding as ever. Beside him was Sullivan, wearing a new uniform with full colonel's insignia, a surprising development for someone she had believed to be retired. Rodriguez was there as well, along with Captain Mitchell and several pilots Morgan didn't recognize. "Welcome to Echo Squadron, Major Morgan," Harmon greeted her, emphasizing her new rank. Morgan blinked in surprise. "Major, sir." "Effective immediately," Harmon confirmed with a slight smile. "You've been promoted to squadron commander of our newest special operations unit." Morgan took in the hangar, where 6 Apache helicopters stood in perfect formation, each modified with specialized equipment that wasn't standard military issue. Along the walls were detailed maps of the world's most challenging terrain, mountain ranges, canyons, dense urban environments. "Operation Nightshade is being officially reactivated," Sullivan explained, "with significant updates based on your performance in Widow's Canyon. This squadron will develop and implement advanced extraction techniques for situations where conventional approaches fail. Your first assignment is to develop a training program based on the techniques you employed at Devil's Gate, Harmon added. We have identified 12 similar terrain features worldwide where American forces operate. Each presents unique challenges that conventional flight doctrine considers impassable. Morgan looked around at the assembled team, recognizing the significance of this assignment. This wasn't just a promotion, it was validation of everything she had worked for, everything she had believed about the value of emotional investment in mission outcomes. Colonel Harmon will serve as operational director, Sullivan continued. I'll provide historical context from the original Nightshade protocols. The rest of the team has been selected based on exceptional flying skills and, he smiled slightly, a tendency to care too much about mission outcomes. Harmon extended his hand. I was wrong about you, Morgan. Your emotional investment doesn't make you vulnerable. It makes you see solutions that others miss. It makes you push boundaries that others accept as fixed. It makes you the exact pilot we need for missions where failure isn't an option. Morgan accepted his handshake, finally understanding what Sullivan had been trying to teach her all along. Her emotional connection to the mission, the very quality that had kept her grounded for years, was precisely what had allowed her to succeed where others had failed. What about Reynolds? She asked, knowing the question needed to be addressed. Mitchell stepped forward. He survived his injuries and is currently in military custody at Fort Leavenworth awaiting trial for terrorism, kidnapping, and attempted murder. The Black River organization has been dismantled, with most of its key personnel either captured or killed during the Widow's Canyon operation. And the directed energy weapon, Morgan pressed. Recovered and returned to the research facility it was stolen from, Mitchell replied, along with valuable data on its field performance that will help improve defensive countermeasures. In other words, Rodriguez interjected with a grin, you didn't just save 847 Rangers. You recovered stolen military tech, neutralized a terrorist organization, and advanced our defensive capabilities. Not bad for someone they wouldn't let fly combat missions. 6 months later, Major Alexis Morgan stood before a class of 20 pilot candidates, selected from across all branches of the military for their exceptional skills and unique psychological profiles. Behind her, a tactical display showed the treacherous terrain of Widow's Canyon, with Devil's Gate highlighted in red. Conventional wisdom says this passage is impassable, she told them, indicating the narrow corridor between towering cliff walls. Flight manuals classify it as a no-fly zone. Tactical doctrine recommends a 50-mile detour to avoid it. She paused, meeting the eyes of each candidate in turn. They're wrong. Morgan activated a simulation showing an Apache navigating the narrow passage with precision that seemed to defy physics. What makes this possible isn't advanced technology or exceptional reflexes, though both help. What makes it possible is something much simpler, something the military has traditionally discouraged in combat pilots. She deactivated the simulation and faced her students directly. Emotional investment in the outcome, caring so deeply about the mission that you find solutions others can't see, being unwilling to accept that something is impossible when lives depend on proving otherwise. At the back of the classroom, Colonel Harmon and Colonel Sullivan watched with quiet approval as Morgan continued her lecture. The former adversaries had found common ground in their recognition of Morgan's unique capabilities and in their shared commitment to the principles she was now teaching. In Echo Squadron, we don't suppress emotion, we channel it. We don't accept limitations, we transcend them. And we never ever leave our people behind, no matter what conventional wisdom says about the odds. Morgan activated a new simulation showing the complex thermal patterns that created the wind window through Devil's Gate. This is the forgotten protocol, the understanding that sometimes the most dangerous pilot isn't the one who feels nothing but the one who feels everything and uses that connection to accomplish the impossible. As her students leaned forward, captivated by both the technical challenge and the philosophical shift she represented, Morgan allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The emotional investment that had once been deemed her greatest weakness had become her defining strength and was now forming the foundation for a new generation of pilots who would redefine what was possible in military aviation. The forgotten protocol wasn't forgotten anymore. It had become the future.